Hey, I'm back with another M3 gaming video. I was gonna do something online on my phone, but I came to realize that I like to have the option to listen to something while I'm playing. So I am not gonna have uh, anything like on TikTok or Instagram. Sometimes I stream there. I don't understand why I can't just stream to those platforms the same way that I do YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, X, whatever you call it now. Um, you would think they would want more traffic, but I don't know. But what I'm going to do is uh, play this strange arc build. I was last night I was playing the Hunter speed loader build, and I was talking about how much I disliked Ophidian aspect because the reload isn't really doing it for me. So I am going to try the Lunafaction boots. So these exotics have had an interesting history in Destiny 2 because for the longest time they didn't increase your reload. They absolutely just automatically reloaded your weapon. um, it required that you stand in a rift while you do that. That's when I started playing it. I think the original was like every time you step into your rift, it automatically reloads. I still wish it did that. That would be a nice little bump. Um, I mean, you could give it a cooldown, but like if people are doing a DPS phase on a boss in a raid or a dungeon or something, lunafactions were absolutely necessary. In fact, they still might be. I don't know. Like even with just the reload speed, um, it may be beneficial to wear them, but when it auto loaded your weapon, like you could shoot infinite like wither hordes, just go boop, 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 you know. Of course, we never had wither horde back then, so let's see. Yeah, it's not bad. I hate having to stand still, but this is kind of like protecting you. That's not bad. I'm using a healing rift. I guess I should just stay on that. As much as I want the extra damage, I am trying to go for flawlesses, so Yeah, it's pretty effective. I can't lie, like this is working. I don't like the play style as much. I like to be able to move, but I think I'll get used to it. That's how warlocks roll. They're like the Gandalfs. Yeah. I mean, these riffs are strong. I probably would be better with the boots of the assembler to make it last longer, but I don't want to stand in a place that long, right? Like I'm trying to keep moving. And considering how fast I'm getting my riff back, I do think it's working, you know. All right, let's go. This is so butt puckering. Oh my god. No one's picking up the lasers. Jeez. I'll get one. I guess I'm glad I did get healing. Because then I can actually kind of stand in place. I didn't think I'd ever appreciate a Lunafaction boots build. But lightning crystals makes your rift back come back so much faster. It's just why not? There's sanguine alchemy, which gives you bonus damage even with a healing rift. I mean that could be good. Vesper of Radius. The little pulses are also aggressive. It's not bad. Because on here you don't even need to get it back fast, so Vesper could be really good. Really. This little added utility works pretty good because for one, this weapon has psycho hack. So like I can stand here, psycho hack him, which means he deals less damage. Right? Yeah. It's pretty good. That's the only thing I think made me want to use this come to pass is that this is significant damage reduction on whatever enemy you consistently target. Um, so that's kind of a help to your teammates a little bit if you can damage them. Yeah. This game is so fucking awesome. I do love it. This stage is just so cool. They said they're gonna do a Crucible stage that looks like this, which would be kind of cool. Mia Luna. Yay. I like this auto rifle. Let's see. Ooh, woof. That is so bad. Go to sleep. I'll be all right. Woof on those perks. Oh my god. That was pretty bad. All right, but also very fun. Let me see. I think I'm going to go listen to some podcasts. This is kind of my morning routine. Sometimes I'll do it while cleaning or organizing it. Today, I think I'm going to do it while I'm on the live stream. I got one topic in the group about masculinity. I think I have two. I'm going to talk about masculinity next Wednesday. And so I'm going to try to do a deep dive. I would probably need to read a book or two, or at least the summaries of a few books on masculinity. That would be interesting. All right.
Background here. Definitely. So back in April, a conservative federal judge in Texas, aka Matthew Kacsmaryk, ruled that the FDA's decades-long approval of mifepristone was invalid and that the restrictions that had previously been on the drug should go back into place. Those were rules like requiring people to see a healthcare provider in person to get a prescription and having to go in person to a pharmacy to pick it up. It is a bullshit semantic argument about the FDA's approval process for this drug. Mifepristone has a decades-long track record of being as safe as it is effective, which is to say extremely. And getting rid of these measures that expanded access would become a huge hurdle for, so many people who need and will need this drug going forward. Which brings us to now. Yesterday's ruling came from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans. All three of the judges on the panels, you could probably guess, are Republicans. Two of them were nominated by Trump, one by George W. Bush. And this was pretty much what we expected from this panel. They didn't go as far as Matthew Kacsmaryk, that Texas judge who ruled that the FDA's entire approval of mifepristone back in 2000 was invalid. They kept the approval in place as well as the later approval of the generic version of the drug. The parts that they take issue with, though, are these later drops of restrictions that made it easier for people to get this drug, which really should tell you a lot about what they take issue with.
Clearly, access and ease, right? That makes women and pregnant people's lives that much better, just being able to access basic healthcare. But alas.
Right.
So now we have to wait to see if the Supreme Court all of a sudden believes in science and bodily autonomy, though I think we know that answer.
Yeah, essentially that is the bind we are in at the moment. They will most likely hear the case in the fall. We will obviously keep you posted when we learn more. That's what we know for now.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak. And y'all, we're going to go from one no good, very bad news story to another as we dig into the harsh conditions that migrants and asylum seekers face right now in all of the United States. Let's start with the latest on how poorly migrants are being treated when Republicans shuttle them across the country. Republican state leaders like Texas Governor Greg Abbott continue the inhumane practice of busing and flying migrants to Democratic-led states and cities. When they arrive, they encounter dire situations with with unstable housing and limited access to resources. I mean, that is if they survive the grueling trips. That was sadly the case for a 3-year-old child who died last week while being bused from Brownsville, Texas to Chicago, Illinois. When asked about the issue, Abbott referred the press to the transit office, but didn't admit any fault or concern for the loss of life. And the human cost of Republicans' brutal policies is just beyond heartbreaking at this point.
Yeah, seriously. So in addition to migrants being moved, there is also some news about Democratic-led communities struggling to provide for them. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, migrants whom Abbott sent to Sacramento, California in June are being told that their access to free temporary housing will likely end on September 30th. That's because local nonprofits and aid organizations are struggling to find more resources. In New York State, Governor Kathy Hochul and New York City Mayor Eric Adams are clearly not on the same page about how to respond to the needs of the more than 100,000 migrants and asylum seekers who have arrived in their state. Just yesterday, the governor's team scolded Adams for his response, or lack thereof. And back in Texas, members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus have called on the federal government to investigate reports of families being separated and alleged human rights violations. So there's a lot of mess just compiling right now.
Definitely. So in the midst of everything that is going on, I know you got to hear from somebody who is trying to help these migrants on the ground. Can you tell us a little bit more about that conversation?
Yeah, I got to chat with Jacob Love, a staff attorney with the Boston-based organization Lawyers for Civil Rights. He's one of the attorneys representing the migrants callously flown to Martha's Vineyard by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. I started by asking Jacob to describe what migrants experienced last year after they were abandoned on the Massachusetts island.
Programs like it are seemingly growing more prevalent by the day, but the Martha's Vineyard flights are a particularly egregious example. The crux of our case against DeSantis and his co-conspirators is that they recruited recently arrived and very vulnerable migrants in Texas to board flights using fraud and misrepresentation. They promised the migrants that they'd take them to a big northeastern city and provide them with things like jobs, immigration assistance, and schooling for their children. But as we all know, none of those things had actually been secured for the migrants, and they were ultimately brought to a small island without the infrastructure to help them. So the Martha's Vineyard flights clearly crossed the line from unethical to illegal, in large part because the migrants were actively deceived and stranded without the promised resources.
And where are the migrants today? Like, what challenges are they still facing at this very moment?
Yeah, so I mean, they faced a lot of immediate challenges. In the Martha's Vineyard case, the flights included men, women, and children, including some as young as 2 years old. The whole ordeal was traumatizing. Most immediately, the migrants were terrified when they realized that they'd been duped and that no one was there to help them.
I'm sure.
They experienced anxiety and intense emotional distress because they didn't know where they'd get their next meal, where they'd sleep, how they'd get off the island, what would happen in their immigration cases. They were thrown into a political firestorm that they didn't want to be a part of, and some even feared for the safety of loved ones remaining in the countries they fled because they could experience violence or retaliation if their identities became public. And because of the xenophobia that stunts like this generate in the United States, we had to file a federal case using pseudonyms for the plaintiffs out of fear for their personal safety.
Oh, wow.
And on top of all that, it'll now be difficult for the migrants to ever trust government officials in this country ever again, especially given that many of them thought they were fleeing corrupt governments for one that they could count on. And to answer your question about where they are now, so many have stayed in Massachusetts, though they've spread out. I think a total of 4 families are still on the vineyard. All of their immigration cases are still pending, so they're dealing with that. They've applied for asylum and U visas, so those are visas for victims of certain crimes. And a lot of them don't have their work permits yet because they have to wait for a period of time after sending in an asylum application.
And I can only imagine the continued emotional distress, like extending from what you already described about landing on the vineyard. And now so much time has passed and they're still not settled. They still don't have what they need.
They still don't have what they need. And this case is likely going to be litigated for a long time. So I imagine it'll be still some time before they get justice, but we're going to continue pushing for it.
Yeah. And you mentioned they were dropped into a political firestorm. And we know that DeSantis picked up this move from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is busing and flying migrants and asylum seekers to Democratic strongholds across the country. And I want to emphasize the human toll of it all, because just last week, a 3-year-old child died while riding on a bus sponsored by Texas on the way to Chicago. So people are now dying because of these tactics. And I'd love for you to describe kind of the conditions on these buses that are sometimes traveling very long distances.
Yeah, so I am not intimately familiar with the conditions on the buses, but looking at the transportation programs more broadly, what they all have in common is that they're deeply unethical. They all prey on migrants that have recently arrived in the U.S., mainly from poverty-stricken and dangerous countries. Many of these migrants had to navigate thousands of miles of difficult terrain with nothing but their clothes, experiencing violence and hunger, all in the hope of getting to the U.S. and building a better life. And these transportation programs exploit that vulnerability and desperation so that governors and presidential hopefuls can score political points. Everyone is free to debate the merits of federal immigration policy, but it's horrific to use desperate people as political pawns. These programs aren't abstract. They have real life effects on real people. The various harmful effects that I can think of off the top of my head include interfering with ongoing immigration cases, bringing people far away from where their cases are scheduled to be heard, dropping people off in locations that don't have the resources to help them, and where they don't know anyone that they can rely on for assistance, exposing people to harsh weather in the Northeast they're not prepared for, overwhelming local nonprofits who have no advance notice of their arrival, and basically just sowing chaos with no regard for what's going to happen to these people.
Right. And I want to stick with Abbott for a quick second, because we know that he's going even further to deter migrants from crossing the border, including installing oversized buoys in the Rio Grande, where 2 bodies have already been found deceased. Plus, Texas state troopers have said they've been given instructions to push migrants back into the river and even deny people water in extreme heat. The Biden administration has sued Texas for some of these inhumane taxes, but what more could they be doing to protect people? Like, what legal protections could they be deploying at this point?
So it is the sole responsibility of the federal government to enforce immigration law. It is not a state's responsibility. So Abbott is overstepping his authority as governor in this situation. The supremacy clause of the Constitution is very, very clear that immigration is the sole arena of the federal government. And so the Biden administration could be acting much more aggressively to counteract these actions that Governor Abbott is taking, and probably should be doing a lot more.
Jacob, thanks so much for joining. What a day. I'm sure we'll be talking to you more, especially as this case advances in the future.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that was my conversation with Jacob Love, a staff attorney with the Boston-based organization Lawyers for Civil Rights. Of course, we will continue to explore the challenges that migrants and asylum seekers are facing in the United States, but that's the latest for now. We'll be back after some ads.
What a Day is brought to you by OneSkin. Listen, I love me some skincare products, but it can be overwhelming shopping for skincare. How do you pick the right products when everything claims to smooth wrinkles and give you that youthful glow? How do you even know what you need? Well, OneSkin has you covered. OneSkin was founded by a team of 4 female PhD-level longevity scientists with over 15 years of experience studying the biology of aging. They discovered the OS1 peptide, which reduces the biological age of skin, which is fascinating and also really cool to like put into your skincare products.
Yeah, and I love that women are behind this because, you know, we want to get right. So I'm here for it. I'm excited. OneSkin is for everyone that wants to prevent or reverse the signs of aging with a groundbreaking approach. OneSkin addresses skin health at the molecular level, targeting the root causes of aging so skin behaves, feels, and appears younger. It's time for you to experience a new skin health routine at a discounted rate today. Get 15% off with code WAD at oneskin.co. That's 15% off oneskin.co with code WAD. We only have one body, one skin, and only you can choose to make it better. Age healthy with OneSkin.
Selling your car to Carvana is as easy as
pie?
Sure. All you have to do is enter your license plate or VIN.
As easy as a stroll in the park.
Okay, then just answer a few questions and you'll get a real offer in seconds.
As easy as singing.
Why not? Schedule a pickup or drop off and Carvana will pay you that amount right on the spot.
As easy as playing guitar.
Actually, I find that kind of difficult. But selling your car to Carvana is as easy as
Can be.
Visit Carvana.com or download the app to get an instant offer today.
Big news! You can now listen to Pod Save America ad-free by joining Cricket subscription Friend of the Pod.
That's right. Your ad fast-forwarding days can now be over. You've toiled long enough. It's time to rest.
You'll also gain access to our new exclusive to subscription bonus content feed featuring The Lucid Show on Cricket, terminally online.
Lucid and the two old men getting to a fart ward in RFK Jr. press dinner. One of the best stories we've covered on the show, period.
And let's not forget the Friends of the Pod Discord community, a place to connect with fellow Cricket listeners and rant about the news without having to fight a blue checkmark Twitter goon. You can also chat directly with John, Tommy, and me about your favorite show and why it's love it or leave it, and more.
We should also mention that subscribing at the Best Friends tier is a super easy way to put your dollars towards helping save democracy. With $10 of your subscription going directly to Vote Save America's grassroots organizing efforts in all 50 states plus DC.
Sign up to Friends of the Pod today by heading to cricket.com/friends, and we will see you on Discord.
Let's wrap up with some headlines.
Headlines.
Save the date for March 4th. That could be when the trial starts for Trump's Georgia election case. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis asked the judge for that day and expressed her support for a speedy trial. As a reminder, Trump faces 13 new criminal charges in Georgia, including one that accuses him of violating the state's Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Willis also requested that he and his 18 co-defendants are arraigned the week of September 5th. It's crazy that this needs to be a consideration, but Willis noted that the dates she proposed wouldn't conflict with Trump's, other legal obligations.
Yeah, because there really are a lot at this point.
Yeah, it's giving get in where you fit in, and he's clearly got dates up and down the Eastern Seaboard, so there you go. If March 4th is approved by a judge as the starting date, the trial would begin one day before Super Tuesday. And that's going to be a hectic news cycle as a dozen states host their Republican primaries. Ridiculous.
Yeah, that'll be chaotic. We have an update on the deadly wildfires in Maui. The death toll from the disaster rose to 110, and authorities have started to release the names of the victims. As of our recording at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, 2 men in Lahaina have been identified, both of whom were in their 70s. Hawaii Governor Josh Green also told reporters earlier this week that multiple young children were among those killed by the wildfire, saying, quote, "Some of the sites are too much to share just from a human perspective." Local officials will continue to partner with federal disaster workers to identify the hundreds of people that remain unaccounted for in the coming weeks. On the recovery front, local community organizers have asked for a pause on donations of clothes, food, and other supplies from those wanting to help. Instead, they ask that people give directly to families who have been displaced by the disaster during this time. Links to those individual fundraisers and stories can be found in our show notes.
Republicans are doing what they do best, bringing the country to the brink yet again. On Monday, Speaker Kevin McCarthy told House Republicans that Congress may have to pass a short-term government funding bill to avoid a shutdown this fall. The House has passed only one of a dozen appropriations bills so far, but there are disagreements among the House Republican leadership about which appropriation bills to take on first. As we've seen, right-wing lawmakers throw plenty of tantrums to get their hard right policies attached to these bipartisan bills. It's no different with the appropriations process. Congress is on its August recess, but the clock is ticking. And it's going to be a tight turnaround to get that funding through between lawmakers' return to work on September 5th and the government funding deadline about 2 weeks later. McCarthy did emphasize on the same call that he doesn't want to set a new deadline past early December, but we'll see about that because I can only imagine his failure right now, considering how much the extremists within his caucus are going to pull him in so many different directions. Brace yourselves. This is going to be ugly, y'all.
Totally. And speaking of Republican foolishness, drag queen Katara Ravache has a drag daughter. Controversial Republican Congressman George Santos, known for fabricating many identities, including that of a good drag queen, has a campaign aide accused of doing the same. The aide, Samuel Mealy, was charged with wire fraud and identity theft in a federal indictment unsealed yesterday. He allegedly impersonated a top aide to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and made fraudulent phone calls and emails to more than a dozen potential campaign contributors. The indictment itself doesn't name the aide Mealy impersonated or George Santos, but the New York Times and other outlets have previously reported that Mealy impersonated McCarthy's aide to fundraise for Santos specifically. A reminder that Santos was charged with 13 federal counts largely tied to financial fraud earlier this year and pleaded not guilty. Oh yeah, and Santos is also facing charges for fraudulent appeals to donors, but who's really surprised there?
Yikes. I mean, Joanne the scammer is on the go.
Seriously.
Dozens of protesters marched to a Miami school district headquarters yesterday to protest the state's new restrictions on how Black history can be taught in public schools. You'll remember that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' administration issued new guidelines for Black history courses last month that drew heavy backlash for what can be said about slavery, particularly how the new curriculum would teach middle school students that enslaved people quote, develop skills, which in some instances can be applied for their personal benefit. Let's just be clear. There's no personal benefit. If I'm enslaved, if I'm in chains, and I'm being tortured and brutalized every single day, there's no benefit.
Yeah, just absolutely no.
Teachers, students, and local labor leaders marched in yesterday's crowd that began in Miami's historically Black Overtown neighborhood. Tennessee Representative Justin Pearson, famously a member of the Tennessee Three, was in attendance and delivered a speech at the rally saying, quote, "The true history is that Black people have always fought to make America what it ought to be, and it has always resisted what it could be. We've always fought for the America that we know is possible. That is not here yet." And if we're talking about Florida as the location, that's about 50 years behind where it should be. Let's just consider not only how they treat Black Americans, but also LGBTQ people or anybody else.
Right. Just about anyone who isn't straight, white, and male, I guess.
Period.
It's not great. And those are the headlines.
One more thing before we go. Speaking of Florida, a couple of days ago, we shared the news that the state has a new law that now prevents educators from using a student's chosen pronouns. This is because of Governor Ron DeSantis' crusade against LGBTQ folks. Over in our Friends of the Pod Discord, Wad Squad listener who goes by AP Schreff wrote, "I'm a Florida assistant principal. Not only can teachers not call students by their chosen pronouns, teachers are also not allowed to use their own pronouns if they do not align with their sex at birth. Honestly, though, I'm not really looking for loopholes. I'm just mostly ignoring it and calling kids what they want.
Hell yeah.
I can get with it."
Yep.
You too can join Friends of the Pod to chat with your favorite Cricket hosts and fellow listeners on our Discord. You'll also access bonus content, ad-free episodes of Pod Save America, and more. Subscribe to Friends of the Pod now at cricket.com/friends.
That is all for today. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe, leave a review, be pro.
That's a pretty good podcast. I like What a Day. So I think I should save this loadout. Let me do that. Okay. So which one? I said Vesper. Yeah. I like the way it looks. I mean, I'm just being real. I like the way it looks. Yeah. Okay. Arc loader, firepower. You got 2 left. Yeah, bolstering detonation. That makes sense. Okay. Recovery. Yeah, recovery, harmonic, solar. Okay. Recovery. Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna put the focus on discipline and recovery. I'm gonna be popping so many rifts that the Reaper is gonna give me the orbs that I need. I don't necessarily need it from anything else. Yeah, and I also get it from that as well. So I can do that, or let's see. Arc weapons, Galvanic traces. All right, let's go to the tower, see what I can find. I'm going to line up my next podcast to listen to. I'm also trying to sync the videos from Wednesday's live stream. I got my iPad in front of me. I tried syncing them like last night, but something happened. I'm not sure what, because I started switching between videos before I synced them. And so when I tried to sync them, like several of the videos just went missing. It's just weird. So now I shrunk the videos down, and from their shrunken state, possibly it will be able to sync. It's going faster for sure. Like yeah. We'll see what happens. I'm gonna open up a few engrams, I guess. Let's see. Well, I do have fewer than 99. They'll be all right. I want to go to Gambit actually. I'm gonna get a few of the scout rifles. Fourth time's a charm while springing one extra perk. It's kind of sad. It's not awful. It's a lot of stability, plus rapid hit and wellspring. Shit, that is actually pretty good for one of these rift bills, like I was saying. I guess I'll move it to my postmaster. So. What's this one? Move that to the vault. All right. Frenzy? No. Shoot the loot frenzy. I think they did say they buff shoot the loot, but I still don't find it any kind of interesting. It would be good on a scout rifle if I don't know if it did something. Okay, now we're getting into something. Snapshot now. Thresh, rapid hit, accurized, arrowhead break, or hammer forge. That's so fucking good. Yeah. Thresh may not be the most, and this is definitely not with surplus, but shit, I would use this. Especially with the field tested, yeah. You probably get really good reload on that. All right. I'm happy with that. I just really wanted a surplus roll with the field tested because they they added field tested to the scout. And I mean I'd rather have frenzy, but whatever, I already have that on one without it. So that gives me a little variety. And I can go back and try out this Vesper Radius in the Vanguard playlist. Get that going. So, all right, let's see. Positively Dreadful. I'm going to listen to that. See what they're talking about.
Rico indicted, and it feels so good. On Tuesday's episode of Pod Save America, hosts John, and Tommy reacted to the latest list of Trump indictments out of Georgia. And beware, it's long. And if you want to stay up to date on the latest indictment news, make sure to check out our daily podcast, What a Day. Strict Scrutiny will also be doing a legal deep dive, so be sure to tune in wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, and welcome to Positively Dreadful with me, your host, Brian Boiler. For my entire adult life, I've heard politicians appeal for votes by saying something like we should end wars abroad and rebuild here at home. So the war half of that formulation is primarily the legacy of the George W. Bush administration and its forever wars, which is why you tend to hear Democrats making that pitch more than Republicans. But the other half, the part about rebuilding here at home, has a much more complicated legacy. And because of that, I think it even lacks a shared meaning among Americans. Rebuild America means something very different to a city dweller than to a person from the hinterlands. But both citizens, I think, would have a sense that it means the government should invest in civic infrastructure so the places we all live in can have better jobs, better public goods, better amenities, the whole deal. Still, and in part because Rebuild America is such a challenge even to define, you can see why politicians like the pitch. It speaks to everyone. It makes everyone think you're talking about their little slice of America. A leader who ended our global misadventures and instead built a bunch of cool stuff that made life better in both red and blue parts of the country would join the pantheon of great presidents. Or at least that's what we'd like to think. Joe Biden has tried much harder than anyone before him to implement this vision. He ended the war in Afghanistan, and then he signed a bunch of bills that have allocated trillions of government dollars and even more private sector dollars to building roads and factories, energy infrastructure, and it just hasn't been a recipe for political success, or at least not yet. You can chalk some of that up to the way the Afghanistan withdrawal happened and the way the national media covered the Afghanistan withdrawal, but I don't think you can make sense of the whole picture without distinguishing between passing bills that envision major infrastructure projects and the actual building. Biden got a stunning amount of legislation passed in his first 2 years given his narrow majorities, but nearly all of the dividends remain theoretical because most of those projects aren't complete or even underway yet, and probably won't be before Biden has to face voters again. So I remember back in January 2021, when I was first starting to think COVID-19 was going to be a big problem for everyone in the world and not just East Asia, and reading about how China had built a 1,500-room hospital in 5 days to accommodate seriously ill patients. And I remember thinking, damn, how is that even possible? In the United States, things don't tend to go that way. We're actually notorious for our boondoggles and cost overruns and the slug-like pace it takes us to complete relatively small projects. The Big Dig in Boston is a canonical example. The high-speed rail in California that never was and seemingly never will be is another. And this contrast, with the political problems it creates for those of us who want a government that helps people so that people aren't so damn skeptical of government, it's given rise to a debate or disagreement about what fundamentally explains why we so often suck at doing stuff and what we should do to get better at it. You all probably know Ezra Klein of the New York Times and David Dayen of the American Prospect. They've gone back and forth on the question a couple times now. Ezra argues that the main problem is red tape. Some of it very well intentioned, but ultimately, in combination, it's crippling and ripe for abuse. David surveys the landscape in the country and notices that we can do things extremely fast when we decide we want to. It's just that those things are backed by powerful interests. And so the key to creating state capacity for progressive ends is for progressives to build comparable power. And I got to say, sorry, guys, both friends of the pod, I don't find this dichotomy very edifying. I feel like it's a debate where one side argues you can't hatch an egg that a chicken hasn't laid, but you also can't conjure a chicken that didn't come from an egg. So both things seem obviously true. And so it is with state capacity. You can find many, many examples of important projects stymied and bloated by bureaucracy. And you can find many other examples where determined interests muscled major projects to completion very quickly. Recently, a section of the I-95 corridor connecting New York to Washington, D.C. collapsed near Philadelphia. And those of us who had grown fatalistic about state capacity kind of shuddered at the thought of a years-long disruption of this incredibly important artery. But Joshua Shapiro, the governor there, managed to get it done in like 2 weeks. In a less inspiring way, a bunch of very powerful people wanted to complete the Mountain Valley natural gas pipeline, which had gotten bogged down in the usual fashion. And so they passed a law basically ordering agencies to finish it and prohibiting courts from tying it up. And that seems like it'll do the trick. So when I hear the question phrased like, do we need a liberalism that builds or a liberalism that builds power? I feel like the answer is yes. Or maybe it's, well, it depends on what we're talking about building in the first place. The bad news is I don't really know what I'm talking about, but fortunately other people do. A bunch of the scholarly legwork that gave rise to this debate about the future of liberalism was undertaken by a University of Michigan law professor named Nicholas Bagley. Nick specializes in administrative procedure and lays much of the blame for our predicament on really people very much like himself. He published an important law review article a few years back called The Procedure Fetish about how a mix of systems that were designed to either sabotage government or keep government honest have combined to make government incapable of dependably building solutions to big problems or even new projects that just make life better. So he's my guest this week, and hopefully he can help us clarify modify the debate a bit and think through what a better mix of systems and powers and authorities would look like. So, Nick, it's great to talk to you again.
It is great to talk to you too, Brian. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, riddle me this. Do we need a liberalism that builds or a liberalism that builds power?
Look, I'm with you on that we need both. I mean, you can't have a liberalism that builds where you can't actually get liberals elected. So it is, in that sense, a false dichotomy. And listening to your intro, I think you're right that there are a lot of high salience projects that can get pushed through when the stakes are high enough. I think one thing that has, gone largely overlooked, at least among the lawyers that I hang out with, is that most projects in the United States are not high salience. Most of them are low salience, they're local, they are regional, they are even just statewide, and they don't attract a lot of headlines. But the structures that we've put in place to govern their approval, govern the permits, govern the regulations, all of those legal structures that we put in place have made it very hard to move those low salience projects ahead. And so I think we actually, in a way, have the worst of all worlds. We've got a set of laws that makes it very hard to build that private interests can overcome when the stakes are high enough, but where determined opposition can frustrate the low stakes stuff that we actually just need day to day. And let me be concrete about it. We've seen kind of three interrelating trends that I think have really given rise to the state capacity movement. We've seen a dearth in affordable housing, which is primarily caused by a lack of supply. Why do we not have enough houses? Well, there's a lot of impediments to actually getting new housing built. And a lot of those impediments are procedural and legal in nature. Most of them don't make the headlines. Most of them are local. The Green New Deal, the idea that we transition to some kind of green revolution infrastructure, is going to require enormous investments in actually like physical land, especially out west, in order to build solar and wind farms. And there too, the particular fights don't tend to be high salience. They tend to be quiet. And that means that the committed opponents of those projects can frustrate and gum up the works. The last, and you did kind of touch on this in your opening, relates to big infrastructure projects like the Big Dig, like the high-speed rail in California. In both cases, the legal structures that we've created have created bottlenecks that make it very difficult to overcome the political resistance to the kind of change that a majority of Americans would, I think, find very appealing.
Do we need a one-size-fits-all approach? I understand that a system that can be gained by powerful interests to overcome hurdles while leaving smaller projects that don't have a lot of political interest behind them is a bad mix. But just as a rule, do we want a catch-all? I'm thinking about it like this. If you came to me and said, hey, we want to spend trillions of dollars to build nuclear plants, solar and wind installations, like modernize the grid, create transmission capacity, and we want to test various means of decarbonizing the atmosphere, and we can do all this in a year or 2 years. And it'll be rough sledding at times, like we're going to screw some stuff up. But at the end, 95% of it will work, and we'll shorten our path to like carbon neutrality by many years. I'd say sign me up. Like that sounds great. Let's like mow over the hurdles to doing that. If you came back to me again and said, we want to build a natural gas pipeline that'll have like a marginal impact on greenhouse gas emissions and energy prices, it'll create 10,000 jobs, but most of them will go away when the construction's over. I might say, okay, but like it's not so important that we mow over the procedural obstacles. Like we can take our time on this so we don't screw up that 5% and then like wreck a community or something like that in the building.
Yeah. So I think this is the internal attitude that a lot of liberals have about these procedures is, gosh, like maybe it's not great what we have now, but it could be much worse. What if you get rid of all these procedural obstacles? Won't you get lots more fossil fuel development? Once you get lots of housing development that we think is actually bad, once you get lots of infringing on, all sorts of rights that people care about, or environmental justice will get trampled, or what if? And I'll just say, I have a couple of thoughts on this. The first thing I'm going to say right out of the gate is the chosen approach to deal with our anxieties has been to create procedural rules that make it hard to do stuff. Who is most adept at navigating procedural rules? It is the very special interests, the very organized interests that you have already decided you don't want to support. In other words, you're going to create obstacles, both to good and bad development, but you're going to favor bad development because the entities that are capable of overcoming those obstacles are going to disproportionately be the incumbents that like the world as it is. You're going to frustrate changes to the status quo. Now, what you might say is, okay, great. So I'm going to come up with a bill. And what I'm going to say is all the heavy procedural rules for the dirty development that I dislike and all of the clean, streamlined rules for the development that I prefer. And there, I just want to say that we live in a country that is sharply divided and where that kind of political deal is simply not on the table. I'm not sure it should be on the table, but what I think is kind of not relevant to what we actually have to accomplish, which is getting to yes across the board. And so there's going to be some bitter with the sweet here. There's no question about it. Saying yes to more projects means there are going to be some bad projects that you prefer in an ideal world not to go forward. But it also means you're going to get a lot more good projects. And over time, I think that favors the progressive agenda. The last thing I'll say is that, the world in which we have a set of rules that are designed to favor one team over the other, that's kind of what we've got right now. There are actually a lot of carve-outs to important statutes that have become the target of a lot of concern in the state capacity movement. So you think about like NEPA, for example. Well, NEPA, actually, there are big carve-outs for new fossil fuel and new natural gas facilities that don't apply to new geothermal or new wind facilities. So already we've got a set of procedural rules that are geared towards incumbents. So I think we just need to be a little less afraid about what the future might bring. And also, we'll just point out, like, this is being done against the backdrop where it is just on the economics alone cheaper to build wind and solar than it is to build fossil fuels. So if we want to level the playing field, we're going to win. But you do have to actually do it.
why is that approach better than the one that I think is kind of happening organically, if in a slightly disorganized fashion, where I think like the liberalism that builds power is in effect in your state, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in California now. And I feel like what was missing for a long time was some coherent sense of what do we want the liberal state where we have power to do. But now it feels like people are wrapping their heads around these issues that you're talking about, like housing is a disaster. And there's like probably no federal way to fix it. So California is starting to use its power to try to make building easier. And I could run down the list of the way the governors in all three of those states and the legislatures have started to get together to do things that they just weren't doing 10 years ago. And it's an impressive list. And it also feels like you aren't making a bunch of compromises, because these are places where liberals control the government. And if you could just get like some level of consensus on what the big problems to be solved are and what priority they should come in, that you could do the climate change stuff without the natural gas stuff. And it, heads we win, tails they lose. And that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. Well, so here's how I think about it. So I think that's true. There's a lot to like, but you have to remember that the legal system is designed in many respects to protect those who are not in power, right? So what we've done is create a series of rules for those who are unhappy about what government is doing to take their complaints to a court. And so the people who are filing these challenges don't need a broad base of political support. And so when you say, let's get a rough consensus around the need to build housing, well, that's fine. You and I can have a rough consensus. Even the majority of folk in Michigan or California may have a rough consensus, but that rough consensus isn't going to extend to the anti-development group down the block. And that anti-development group has all of these laws that they can point to and invoke in order to take their concerns in front of a judge. And the judge may halt whatever development may exist in its tracks, notwithstanding the broad base of political support that you might have. So I think that the desire to say, let's win some elections, let's get our priorities straight, let's push these projects through, I think there may be a bit of wishful thinking there, given the structures that we've created, the kind of hurdles that we put up to any kinds of these projects making it through. We're so worried about the possibility that we might do bad stuff that we frustrated a whole lot of good stuff too.
But I don't totally understand how these two things are different. And like, this is a interesting backstory here. It's like Nick and I got to know each other around a decade ago because conservatives kept looking for things that they could find in the Affordable Care Act and filing lawsuits so that they could get the law thrown out. And it's like roughly analogous to what you're talking about. And I found that very frustrating. And it like affected in a permanent way the way I think about the court and our jurisdiction. Yeah, just like all kind, it was a very eye-opening experience. But when I think about it, I think that the solution is kind of like what just happened with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Like if you can get the consensus among a majority to do the thing, that thing can include the streamlining and procedural changes that will make it much harder for the the NIMBY group down the street or whatever it is to file the lawsuit to stymie the project.
I take your point. Yeah. So look, there's truth to that, right? No question. If there's consensus, you're able to overcome a lot of these obstacles. Trouble is, I think there's less consensus on many of these issues than you might think, including among the progressive establishment, right? So one of the common complaints you will hear to proposals that I make is, well, gosh, if you don't allow us to bring suits under NEPA to challenge fossil fuel projects, we're going to get a lot more of those projects, and they're going to be online for decades, and you're going to create a bunch of more incumbents that are going to continue spewing out, climate greenhouse gases for a long time to come. And the view of the environmental groups that have gained power by exploiting procedural opportunities is that it would be too risky to give them up. And those environmental groups are very influential. They're influential in Washington. They punch above their weight, and that's good by and large. But it means they're wedded to a set of tactics that they honed in the 1970s in an effort to put a stop to what was at the time so extremely reckless development. So then you say, okay, well, maybe we can get some of them on board. Well, okay, but maybe you can't get all of them, and maybe that frustrates a deal, right? So I think that's actually harder. Like when we all agree about housing, we actually don't all agree at the level of like the mezzanine details, and like that's where a lot of the shooting is. Then you want to say, okay, well, let's look at what happened with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Well, a couple of thoughts. Like one is that was a retail level change for a single project, so that's not going to scale super well. There were actually some substantial changes to the National Environmental Protection Act, and the idea was that NEPA review is taking too long, and so we're going to place some time limits on NEPA review, and we are going to create some page limits so that there aren't going to be these extraordinarily long 4,000-page reports and the like. And these were viewed as kind of modest steps in the direction of reducing the burdens on agencies to get to yes on important infrastructure developments. But the key thing they didn't do is change anything about the availability of judicial review. And the thing that's driving the delays, the thing that's making it impossible to get anything done, is that the agencies are nervous as all get out, that they're going to invest time and energy in something, and at the end of the day, the courts are going to come in and blow it up. And so they cross their T's, they dot their I's, they tie their shoes, they turn around in knots, they hire 17 different experts, and it's an enormous amount of time, resources, and energy. And the thing that's causing that investment, we still haven't addressed, because I don't think there is deep agreement about the need to rethink the procedural rules that are gumming up the works. I think there is some high-level agreement that there are some problems, but I think there's much less agreement on how we should try to get at them.
just as a matter of personal curiosity about how you came to be interested in this issue and also how you homed in on the solutions that you have homed in on, is like separately, you've done a bunch of work about the sort of unprincipled doctrines that the Supreme Court uses to stymie agency action, right? Like they are controlled by 6 very conservative or right-wing justices who don't want the federal government to be doing anything. And so they come up with legal theories about why those actions aren't allowed. And I mean, it strikes me that in separately writing about how state capacity can return to the United States, you've come up with a program or like are pointing in a direction that would circumvent that problem. And that doesn't strike me as likely a coincidence.
Yeah, it's not at all a coincidence. So personal history here, I started my career as a government lawyer. I joined the Justice Department on the appellate staff in the Civil Division, where I was defending government actions from challenge. And I did it because I thought the work was likely to be interesting, which it was, and I'd work with wonderful people, which I did. But I didn't know how I'd feel day to day about the work, because I too had come out of a law school experience where, Brown v. Board is, one of the kind of canonical cases, and you read all these, kind of David against Goliath stories where heroic ACLU or environmental lawyers hold the government to account, make sure that they're doing the right thing by the public. And these are familiar stories to us from television, from the movies, and again, in law school. And so I showed up at the Justice Department, and I'm now the man who is potentially the target of these lawsuits. And the people I'm litigating against are by and large awful. They are narrow interest groups that operate in grubby ways and attempt to get by hook or by crook whatever advantage they can out of the legal process. And I felt virtuous in trying to stop them from securing unfair advantage in the courts. In other words, the story that we're told about David against Goliath turns out not to be true. It's usually Goliath against the government. And that made me pause and think, well, hold on. Are these legal rights that we're granting so promiscuously, are they actually serving the benefit of the American public, or are they serving the advantage of the groups that are best able to exploit those opportunities? And then, like you said, we met during the debates over the Affordable Care Act. And here's a law passed in 2010, and it's then litigated to the hilt in 3 existential challenges over the course of the next decade as the thing is rolled out in fits and starts. Medicare and Medicaid were adopted in 1965. There were no lawsuits challenging their constitutionality. They were up and operational the following fucking year. Like, it's a different kind of world we live in, where we have licensed private groups with narrow interests to exploit procedural rules to their advantage and to basically suborn the machinery of government to their own ends. And I became convinced too that liberals just weren't seeing this. And I think part of the problem is like there's so many damn lawyers around in liberal circles. And look, I like lawyers. My brother's a lawyer. My wife is a lawyer. My dad's a lawyer. I love them, right? But lawyers are oriented to problems in a particular way, which is if you got a lawyer and there's a problem, you think, well, let's come up with some kind of procedural solution. Maybe the courts can help us. And I think to myself, gosh, like anybody who's ever operated in an organization, nobody ever thinks like to make this organization run more effectively, what I need to do is bring in more lawyers and more rules, right? Like you think to yourself, like, gosh, maybe we need somebody who can manage effectively, someone who can run a meeting, somebody who can actually bring people to the table and work through common problems. So all of that, I think, came together to really drive home to me that I think the people my tribe, were missing an important part of the puzzle. We as lawyers gain power through these procedures and through the courts, and we're comfortable with them, and they make us comfortable. I think it's a really bad way to try to run a country.
So I have a few observations. First is that I think Goliath versus Leviathan would be a great allegorical monster movie. Yeah. Second is that lawyers solved a huge problem for Crooked Media, that we had a programming hole for legal affairs issues, and now we have a great legal affairs podcast with at least one of your colleagues.
With my colleague, Leah Lippman. It's a wonderful podcast. And so, in that sense, lawyers we'll pull our weight.
And you've been a wonderful guest for these first 25 minutes. But so if that's your origin story onto this topic, let's step back even further and give listeners the bigger origin story of like the condensed history of America going from like the interstate highway system and the Manhattan Project to like, sorry, we don't know how to build subways in actual Manhattan anymore.
Oh, it goes back even further. I mean, this is where I get to put on my administrative historian hat. So I think we've got this prevailing myth in the United States that the kind of the court-centric model that we've all got in our heads is a legacy of the founding generation. It's Marbury against Madison. Like we do things in the courts, and if it's a little slower, well, that's just how we conduct our affairs. And that turns out to be completely wrong, like completely bass-backwards. So at the beginning of the country and the beginning of the 19th century, there was a very strong legal norm that the different branches of the government, executive, legislative, and judicial, all operated in their own separate spheres. So just as like the executive branch couldn't purport to overturn a Supreme Court decision, so too the courts couldn't purport to overturn an executive branch action. You couldn't go in there and say, well, that exercise of your discretion, I think it's an abuse of your discretion, or I think it's arbitrary or capricious, or even I think it's unlawful. In all of those cases, unless the executive branch was operating far outside the bounds of any reasonable understanding of what the law required, unless that was the case, courts said, our job is done. We are hands off. We're backing off altogether. There was a limited role for constitutional review, so they would review congressional statutes from time to time. There were some kind of unusual statutes against individual officers that would come up and would have effects on administration. But by and large, the court said, this is not our business. And that really only started to change.
Vote them out if you have a problem with it.
Absolutely. It was like, look, like that's the political branches. We're doing our own thing over here. And if you have a complaint about administration, that's why we have elections. Beginning of the 20th century, we get the progressive era. And rapid industrialization, urbanization, all these changes are afoot. And the progressives start creating these public public utility commissions to regulate really all parts of American life. And these commissions, they look a little bit like your local electricity regulator, except their hands were in a lot of different lines of business. And their mode of regulation was pretty unusual given our historical pattern. And it made the lawyers especially really nervous. And so the lawyers started to say, listen, could we please try to get a handle on some of the high-handedness that we see in these commissions? Can we try to maybe make them a little more sensitive to rights? Courts, can you maybe treat these commissions not like independent executive branch actors, but treat them as almost like lower courts? And then you can review their judgments and decisions. And then if it's unreasonable, you can push back. And for a time, that move was resisted. It was like, really, I'm not sure we can do this. And it sort of slowly worked its way into the edges of how the courts thought about these problems. And then you get the 1930s and the New Deal. And the New Deal creates a whole bunch more regulatory agencies, and the lawyers start freaking out even more. So by the time the Second World War ends, Congress comes together and says, hey, you know what? We do need a framework statute to govern the proliferation of federal agencies. We do need some rules of the road. And we're going to make sure that when agencies act, they have to answer for the courts if they don't, follow the rules that we're laying down. But we're going to be pretty spare on the page. We're not going to say very much. So 1946, you get the adoption of the Administrative Procedure Act, which is like the Bible for the way that the courts interact with the executive branch. That's still on the books at the time we get the international highway system, the time we get rapid industrialization in the post-war era, the time we get the big 1950s boom, a lot of the development that we still rely on today. All of that, great big water projects out west that build the cities that we now, are now growing by leaps and bounds. All of that happens, and people start again to get nervous about the growth that they're seeing, that they're witnessing. And particularly, you get a bunch of different kind of movements coming together. You get the anti-Vietnam movement, which drives a lot of distrust in the federal government. You get the anti-Watergate, the Watergate episode, which again drives institutional trust through the floor. You get a lot of environmental concerns, and you get consumer safety advocates kind of coming to the fore for the very first time. And so the kind of Ralph Nader sort of environmental revolution that occurs in the early 70s entails a commitment, first and foremost, to getting the courts involved, getting them to say, hey, listen, big business, big government, big labor, you guys have been inattentive to interests that we care about. We want you, the courts, to stand up heroically, like you did during the civil rights movement, like you did to protect those whose voices were unheard. We want you to speak for the trees and for the consumers. And only through you can we be safe. And that move made a lot of sense in the 1970s, but we haven't rethought it in the 55, 60 years since. We're still stuck with the same kind of framework that we had as our legacy of that era. And, the costs of gumming up the works in that way were not all that salient for a while, but they've become extremely salient in the past 5 to 10 years in a way that suggests that we need a new revised settlement in how we think about the extent to which we're trying to push government through rigid legal procedures.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how feasible it is to have a big government that either struggles to do stuff or does stuff really efficiently. Can either of those things actually be viable for a long time? So I have a thought experiment. Imagine two governments. Each one is trying to build a widget factory. The first one goes to great lengths to avoid any hint of abuse, right? So it undertakes competitive bidding. It does a lengthy cost-benefit analysis. It submits to judicial review. It does its own lengthy review of externalities. It scrutinizes the builder's labor practices to make sure that the people that they hired aren't being exploited. And then after 3 years of that, there's still no widget factory. And everyone's mad. And they all say, government can't do anything well. The second government decides they're just going to execute, right? They mow over those obstacles and build a widget factory very quickly. And then people get to work and they're happy for a second. But then it turns out that the widget factory was built by a major donor to the head of state. And it leaked these forever chemicals into the water supply and then covered it up. And so after 3 years with a widget factory, everyone's mad. And they all say the government can't do anything well. So you run a third government. You also want to build a widget factory. How do you avoid either of those two pitfalls?
Yeah. So the first is to say, I think you're onto something important in suggesting that there's not an all or nothing right answer here. There's a calibration problem, which is nobody wants Robert Moses, mowing down big neighborhoods in New York City to push through his pet projects anymore, right? Nobody wants to go back to that. At the same time, you can think that maybe we've gone a little bit too far in the opposite direction about being afraid of the Robert Moses of the world. In terms of the things that I think actually, the reason I do think there is a bit of a third way available is that we have grown accustomed to thinking that the only way to protect against abuse is to force more and more procedural rules onto these factories that want to open or the rules that need to get adopted by agencies. And I think to myself, well, there really are other ways. If you're concerned about environmental protection, you can adopt laws or rules governing specifically what you can or cannot do in a facility. You don't need to put it through some weird, community benefits procedural process and then subject it to intensive judicial review. You could just develop better rules governing conduct. And I think sometimes we use our procedural rules when we are afraid of doing that or when we're nervous about doing that. So we say under NEPA, just consider all the environmental consequences. Just think about them and then subject that to a long and tortured process of judicial review. And what I'd like to say is maybe we should just have better rules about what private actors can or cannot do in order to prevent them from imposing externalities on the rest of us and move a lot of this out of the courts and move it back to the bureaucracy. And the last thing I'll say on this is just, I think part of the reason I'm pushing uphill on this is I think people don't really trust our institutions and our bureaucracies. And a part of my project is to try to push back on that and to say, listen, if you want to have entities that broadly represent what Americans care about, not perfect, but you actually could do a lot worse than looking at our agencies. They're staffed by people who want to serve. They're staffed by people who generally don't want to serve for highly ideological reasons, but because they want to advance people's lives, who actually have to confront trade-offs in their day-to-day jobs, and who represent a pretty wide swath of people. Now, the rise of educational polarization in the country means that that's not uniformly the case. There are certainly people who distrust agencies for some very good reasons. But at the same time, I do think that if you care about the values of environmental protection or environmental justice or workers' rights, I don't know why on earth you would think that the courts are the right entities to turn to protect those values. Like, it just seems like a very strange move for progressives, especially in a world where we now have a 6-3 ultra-conservative Supreme Court and are likely to have it for the remainder of our productive lifetimes.
That's a really depressing last observation there. But setting that aside, and I want to get back to the courts because it does feel like the courts loom extremely large in this analysis and thus probably point to at least a big piece of the solution. But like, you know, I'm with you in that I absolutely want to see Joe Biden's infrastructure bill become bridges quickly, not just because I want him to get reelected, but because like he wouldn't have passed the bill if there was no need for it. Like there wouldn't have been any demand for it, right? But at the same time, that like even if you take the judicial review question out of it, the grass is always greener kind of thing that I was alluding to with that thought experiment. It comes to like that thing that I ran past you about the widgets was kind of based on a different aspect of the healthcare reform fiasco. I remember the failure of healthcare.gov and how demoralizing that was. A big part of what made it so demoralizing is it was like they launched it years after the law passed and they still couldn't build the website right. Okay. But I also remember that like the knee-jerk response was, well, President Obama, why didn't you just get Amazon to make the website? They know how to do that, obviously. It's just a marketplace. Like, just have them do it. Why didn't you think of that? And President Obama said something like you think it would be better if we passed this big law that allocated all this money, and I took that money to people who donated to my campaign and said, here, build me a website. And like in the pressure cooker of that moment where the website wasn't working, I was kind of thinking, yeah, I would prefer that. But just as a general rule, like when I read stories about cronyism, it pisses me off. Like I get genuinely angry at politicians who do that. And I realized that like a big part of me, as much as I want Joe Biden to be able to like point to the stuff that he built by the time he faces voters next year, I also really do want the government to be making decisions about what they're doing on some kind of neutral basis. And that like whether it's a liberalism that builds or liberalism that builds power, however you want to talk about it, but like you risk throwing out that baby with the bathwater and you're going to rile a bunch of people up with ultimately like decisions that are not maybe even venally corrupt, but it's like you promised to go build something. And so you go to the people that you think you know how to build it best and you ask them to do it, but it turns out that you know them because you're friends and now you're just a corrupt politician.
Yeah. No, look, I think the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater is real and you want to be cautious about being about any kinds of changes that you're going to make, of course. But just because there's a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater doesn't mean the bathwater is at the right level right now. And again, the question of calibration is really hard. I think people hear that what I say and they think, well, you just don't want any rules at all. You just want to go to executive fiat. You want Trumpian tyranny to rule the day. And that's not at all where I'm at. What I do think has happened is that we have become too enamored. Like if you have your anxiety about cronyism, the way that is expressed in our political culture is for you to adopt some cumbersome rule that every agency across the board then has to follow into perpetuity and then has to devote resources and personnel to managing and then can be subjected to judicial review and is amplified again, not just across like a particular project that you might care about, but every project. And everybody becomes defensive and cautious in a way that actually ill serves us across the board. So you might say, hold on, Brian, I understand that you're really worried about cronyism. Let's create some pretty, either sort of more moderate safeguards on that. Maybe what we're going to do is focus on bringing in good, high quality personnel to our agencies and making sure that they're not subject to direct political influence on these kinds of decisions, but not subjecting their decisions to like outside double checking by the courts, right? You might think of it as a management problem, bring in high quality people who are unlikely to be corrupt. Maybe if you're afraid about cronyism, you think, well, hold on, how does this happen? Well, it happens because, maybe you're worried that civil servants are going to get bought off. It turns out that kind of corruption in the United States is very rare, but to the extent you're worried about it, well, then come up with better rules about how to compensate people fairly so that they're less tempted to do that and create systems of accountability internal to agencies where that kind of behavior is going to get caught. I think we have this temptation to think that there's a problem. There's got to be some kind of procedural solution. And often, like, that's just not the way things work. And it's more complicated than that. I'll add, like one of the ways you see this in like operation, it drives you crazy when you work in government. I just got done with a stint working for Governor Whitmer. Conflict of interest rules are so pervasive across government for exactly the reasons that you give. And obviously nobody wants a sharp conflict of interest on a decision of importance. But some of these conflict of interest rules are so broad that they make it impossible to bring in anybody who actually has expertise in the thing that you care about. And again, it's not that you want to get rid of all conflict of interest laws. You want to think carefully about the costs and benefits of those particular structures.
Yeah, I mean, just actually hearing you run through that, I was reminded that the Supreme Court has more or less like legalized corruption. And like perhaps a better remedy for this concern that rebuilding state capacity will lead to a boom in corrupt practice is to criminalize corruption again, quite apart from the rules and procedures that go into an agency implementing a law and creating a dam or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the big questions lurking underneath my project, and I think is a genuinely hard one, is if you care about state capacity, you have to think hard about personnel, about who you bring on and how you hire them and how you fire them. And one of the big problems for government agencies across the board is it's hard to fire people. And that is a very serious problem. We do that for good historical reasons. We don't want President Trump to come in and mow down down the civil service. At the same time, we do have to ask ourselves questions about the costs of that approach. And we want to think about whether we're getting the balance right. And it's a hard thing to say in the current environment where the attacks on the civil service are coded as right-wing. But you can be left-wing and care about government performance and think it's really important to have the ability to say to somebody who's not performing, you got to go.
Do you think your project would be much easier if we had a robust record of executives and government actors who were being held to account for violating laws, whether they be corruption laws or for polluting or whatever it is? And like, you know, it's like, I feel like it's a little flip to be like, nobody went to prison for the financial crisis and to use that as like a metonym for the whole government. But I do think that if the norm was more like, if you do bad deeds with lots of public resources, you risk going to jail. And you had a framework that proved that we would put people in jail who did stuff like that there would be less resistance among liberal skeptics of state capacity or progressive skeptics of state capacity, because they'd think, okay, we can hand this over to the political branches and it won't be a huge risk, because if a corrupt administration comes in or whatever, there's a backstop, which is that when they get caught breaking the law, they're going to.
Well, I think the move is at a high level the right one, which is asking about alternative methods of accountability for bad conduct. I'm very skeptical about criminal justice system being an effective mechanism because it tends to work episodically. It has a very high burden of proof, and that's very difficult to overcome. It's a bazooka. You can't fire all that often, and it can be a little bit capricious in that way. I might think of it actually, and I should say also that many of the things that people worry about most that government might do are not plausibly criminal by any stretch of the imagination, right? People are very upset that you might want to open a mine near them. Well, like that's not, unless there's out and out corruption, it's unlikely to be itself criminal. So you're going to need to come up with other mechanisms to make sure that folk who are making these decisions are taking the public interest into account. And I would think that the more supple mechanisms are things like elections. One of the reasons that I think this debate is so hard is that we, especially at the local level where a lot of these decisions are made, like the democratic systems that we have in place, the level of accountability on the public, given the dearth of local journalism, given the way that people aren't paying close attention, I think that's a much bigger problem. And that's where I would focus our efforts in revitalizing state and local democracy.
When you say that like some of the things the government might do, like for instance, build a mine somewhere that people don't want, aren't illegal or aren't plausibly violations of criminal law, like I agree, but also isn't that sort of just like a product of the snapshot of today? Like you could say, go ahead and build your mine, but it is illegal to leach a bunch of heavy metals into the water supply. And if you get caught doing that, you could go to jail or you could face a huge fine, and it'll put your mine out of business, and we'll use the money to clean up your mess. Like that would be a huge deterrent effect to somebody building a mine without like thinking through how to do it.
Yes, and
in an environmentally sound way.
We do have those laws on the books. They are enforced sometimes, and sometimes not as aggressively as you'd like, but we do have those, and those do serve as a check. I thought you were directing your attention more at like, how do you make sure that government officials aren't screwing around, aren't making decisions that benefit their cronies at the expense of the public?
I'll just make the point in the most general possible way is that at the outset, you mentioned that like a good way to do this would be to stop putting everything in review processes and just be a little bit more explicit about what is and isn't allowed. And if your concern is cronyism, illegalize cronyism. If your concern is like the way we build mines now is environmental ruinous, then you...
Yeah, 100% on the same page.
So if you were God Emperor of America, but a benevolent one, and you didn't just want to wield state power for your own self-aggrandizing purposes, what institutions will you set up or take down to make it possible for the government to do big things quickly, but insulated from some of these problems, and also like for the benefit of the public, for the benefit of the public and the politicians, so that politicians who promise to do X have a fighting chance to do it before they go back to the voters?
Yeah, so a lot of my recommendations are negative, which is that law should do a whole lot less than it does, which is to say we should eliminate the ready availability of judicial review for a lot of categories of agency action. This kind of suggestion is greeted with horror among my lawyerly colleagues, but NEPA, when it was adopted, didn't contain a provision about judicial review. The courts just made it up. The court said, we're going to review this and say that if you didn't adequately take into account environmental concerns, we're going to blow up your agency action. Well, like, the courts made that up at the time. They can unmake it today. They're unlikely to, but they could. And we certainly could curtail the ready availability of judicial review for a wide range of agency actions. I think that would help both at the state and local level and at the federal level. Beyond that, I think we need to be thinking hard about placing time limits on some of these permitting regimes, which is to say not just making it a little bit easier to get through them, but also basically saying that once you pass a certain point, like the default is yes, the default is not no. In terms of other changes that I'd like to see the nationalization is the wrong word, but a more adroit use of federal law to deal with real federal problems. By that I mean, right now we have a big issue with electric transmission lines across state lines. So there's a lot of wind and solar out west, and we want to site things out there because there's a lot of available space and a lot of available natural benefits out there. But in order to get that power out east, you need big interstate transmission lines. And right now there's no federal system that akin to the way we do interstate pipelines, for example, to allow us to easily pull off that kind of interstate transmission. That's an urgent priority and something that we should take out of the hands of state and locals. I think states should start thinking hard about moving more housing policy out of local hands. So you see this in California most aggressively. But those moves involving builders' remedies, involving saying to localities, we're not going to let you get away with foreclosing all building in your communities, those strike me as healthy and responsive to genuine concerns of the broader statewide electorate, and not just likely to be captured by local interests. So that's part of the package of changes that I think would help.
Are there un or underutilized powers of the federal government or state governments that exist now that you think could overwhelm some of these obstacles, and we're just not using them because people are scared of the political ramifications or whatever, or they just don't know they have the power?
Some of that, right? So when you're talking about states preempting local laws, that gets politically very hard very quickly, right? You saw this with the response to Kathy Hochul's effort to improve housing availability in New York. The suburban legislators in Long Island in particular pushed back hard. So politically, a lot of these efforts are very challenging. In terms of the powers that are on the books, governors, including Governor Whitmer, when I worked for her, are working to the extent that they can. So there's a fair amount of what you might think of as nitty-gritty organizational work, making sure that the agencies are all talking to each other, having somebody coordinate timelines so that we're all on the same page about how things are supposed to proceed, trying to make sure that one person has visibility into different permits that might at different points become roadblocks or bottlenecks to particular construction. So kind of put all of that together, and that's helpful. But at the end of the day, the governors and mayors and president are subject to laws. And unless and until you want to think about getting rid of those laws, it's going to be sort of baby steps. You mentioned Josh Shapiro at the beginning of the hour, and in reconstructing the highway, what he did was he exercised his emergency powers to say, we have an emergency, we're going to waive all of the normal laws that would otherwise impair us from moving forward quickly. I wrote a lot of executive orders that looked like that during the COVID pandemic, working for the governor, that said, we're also going to waive all these laws in this particular context to deal with a genuine emergency. And indeed, the governor of Hawaii just issued an emergency order, an executive order declaring an emergency pertaining to housing on exactly this basis. And I love the creativity, I really do. But when you're thinking about the day-to-day actions of governing, when you're thinking about housing policy or energy policy, you can't do that under emergency authority. That's not a sustainable approach in the long run. It's probably not legal in the short run. And so you really are going to have to create a change in the way we think about overseeing the government and making sure it stays within bounds. It's really a change in legal culture and broader political culture. And I think that's going to be something that has to come through the legislatures at the end of the day. It's got to be something we all collectively support.
And not for nothing, the use of emergency powers, maybe not in the Josh Shapiro example, but in the Governor Whitmer example, there's backlash. Sometimes it's really ugly.
There's some really ugly backlash. There was.
But here's the thing is that, obviously I think what happened in Michigan was disgusting, but not what Governor Whitmer did, but the backlash. But in general, I think I would be appreciative as just a citizen if I had leaders that I thought were a bit more willing to court some backlash to do important things on an emergency basis if they weren't just clearly breaking the law. One thing we haven't talked about is just the culture of Democratic Party liberalism today. Is that a lot of it I feel is built around trying to avoid that kind of conflict, right? We're moving this direction, but there's still a lot of resistance to just abolishing the filibuster. And the concern is all these questions about are we going to get along, and what's going to happen if we pass this bill without a filibuster? They're just going to come repeal it, and so we're going to have this seesaw of power, and we're going to live to regret it. And the rules that they are reluctant to change are ones that are in some sense meant, I think, often in a vain way to avoid that kind of dissension. And the procedures and rules and the things that you think that we need less of, and I think I tend to agree, wherever their origins are, they serve a similar role, or at least I think that's what the people who support them think, is that the obstacles to building things is to prioritize consensus over execution, so that half the people aren't pissed off all the time and then trying to tear down what the other half built when the tables turn. And if that's the case, where does the will to have a more, damn the torpedoes attitude towards governing come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I wish I had a better answer for you. The damn the torpedoes approach is not, at the current moment, I think, the dominant position in the Democratic coalition. And in order to get there, we're going to have to pick some fights with friends. And it's hard to fight with friends. Nobody likes to fight with friends. And
to fight with enemies too. You got to want to do that.
Yeah, but it's always more convenient to fight with the other team. And on this one, I think there's it's hard because there's no natural political home for the torpedoes approach. There's a certain kind of libertarian sort of let's get rid of some government regulation inflection to a lot of what I say. And not because I'm a libertarian, but because they see some of the same problems that I see. And so there's common cause to be made with some right-thinking folk who are also frustrated at the way the government impairs progress. But that means that you're looking at a cross-coalitional movement that doesn't command a majority among either Republicans or Democrats. How do you get to yes when they're really just kind of a rump part of the party that's kind of screaming in the wilderness? I don't know the answer to that. I think the YIMBY movement in California has had pretty remarkable success at moving the needle. I think they've been strategic and pretty relentless at trying to achieve their goals. And I wonder if that's a model that will start to seep out into the environmental movement when it comes to some of these renewables, or if it'll seep out into the broader conversation. But I'm pretty confident about my analysis of the problems, and that I'm pretty confident we'd be better off if we could move to the place that I'd like to be, I am much less confident that I know how to get there from here.
I mean, just as a persuasion question, like for how do you pick these fights without permanently rupturing the coalition, is that I feel like a lot of the people who are skeptical of charging ahead to a more state capacity forward system are people who 10 years ago, when you and I were talking about healthcare, looking at the new healthcare system and thinking we put all this effort into compromise, it got us 0 votes. Now we have this kludgy healthcare framework that was designed not to disrupt anyone's like status quo ante. People were still furious. It took years to roll out. There's still 20 million uninsured people.
Tired of cloud chaos? Get Cloud Smart. Designed for a multi-cloud world, VMware cross-cloud services help you manage all of your clouds as easily as one. VMware, the smarter way to cloud. Learn more at VMware.com.
A race to evacuate a Canadian city, mortgage rates reach new heights, and a very mysterious fire at a very wonky pub. That's some of what we'll get to today on the show. I'm Jeff Pierre, and this is the 7 from the Washington Post. It's Friday, August 18th. Let's get you caught up with today's 7 stories. Number 1, U.S. intelligence says Ukraine won't meet the key goal of its counteroffensive. Ukraine wants to retake the southeastern city of Melitopol. It's a vital transit hub. It allows Russia to move troops and equipment from Crimea to other occupied territories in Ukraine. But according to a U.S. intelligence assessment, Russian minefields and trenches will stop Ukrainian forces from reaching the city. If that assessment is correct, it'll raise questions about why an offensive, backed by tens of billions of dollars of Western support, fell short. Number 2, a wildfire in Canada has triggered a race to evacuate an entire city. Yellowknife is the capital of the Northwest Territories. It has about 20,000 residents, and authorities are trying to evacuate them all as a raging wildfire approaches the city. People have been urged to leave by noon local time today. Wildfires have charred nearly 33 million acres in Canada this season, an area equivalent to the size of Alabama. The fires have often blanketed the U.S. with smoke. They've been fueled by long-term drought and extreme temperatures, which have been intensified by climate change. Number 3. Homebuyers beware. Mortgage rates have reached the highest point since 2002. Yesterday, the average 30-year fixed loan hit 7.09%. Rates have more than doubled in the past 18 months, and these higher rates can add hundreds of dollars to people's monthly mortgage payments. Since March of last year, the Federal Reserve has repeatedly increased interest rates in an attempt to fight inflation. Mortgage rates tend to move in tandem with these increases. Despite these newly high rates, though, house prices have also stayed high. Number 4, President Biden is hosting the leaders of Japan and South Korea today. The 3 leaders are meeting at Camp David in Maryland. They're expected to agree on ways for the U.S. and its 2 most important Asian allies to cooperate more on security. The Biden administration sees Japan and South Korea as crucial to countering rising threats. That includes China's military, North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The standalone meeting is the first of its kind, and it's a big deal. Relations between Japan and South Korea have historically been difficult, but tension in the region is drawing the U.S. and the 2 countries closer together. Number 5, this fall is shaping up to be a chaotic time for vaccinations. An updated COVID booster is about a month away. Flu shots will roll out as usual, and for the first time, vulnerable infants and seniors can be immunized against RSV. These vaccines will protect people ahead of the respiratory virus season, but deploying them at the same time is difficult and is causing confusion. Patients perplexed by changing coronavirus vaccine guidance now have even more shots to consider, and doctors have to figure out how to explain the nuances and unknowns of new vaccines at a time of rampant misinformation. Number 6, Bradley Cooper is getting criticized for his fake nose in a new movie about Leonard Bernstein. A new Netflix biopic of the famous Jewish composer has drawn accusations of anti-Semitism online. A trailer released this week showed Cooper with a large prosthetic nose. People say it perpetuates an offensive stereotype about Jewish people and have criticized the decision not to cast a Jewish actor in the role. But Bernstein's family and the Anti-Defamation League have defended Cooper against the accusations. And at number 7, the mystery of a fire at England's wonkiest pub. The Cricket House was built in 1765 near the village of Himley in England. It was famous for being very, very crooked. It leaned more than 15 degrees to one side. It was recently sold to new owners, but earlier this month, it burned to the ground. Police say they suspect the fire was deliberate, and after the pub burned, local officials say its remains were illegally demolished. Longtime customers of the Cricket House, Laura and Tom Catton, recounted their memories of the pub to the Associated Press.
And just describe to someone who's never been there what the pub was like. Crazy.
Upstairs and downstairs, actually.
Yeah.
One gear upstairs, yeah.
And a lot of people thought they were drunk when they walked in because everything was all over the place. It doesn't do justice for name Cricket House. It was all over the place when marbles roll uphill, and yeah, you'd have to be seen to be believed, and they can't be, unfortunately, anymore.
So far, no suspect has been named, but locals are demanding that their beloved pub be rebuilt brick by brick, just as wonky as it always was. That is the show for this week. The assistant producer of The 7 is Taylor White. Special help this week from producer Charlotte Freeland. The staff writers are Jamie Ross and Hannah Jewell. John Taylor is our editor. Additional editing by Christina Quinn. Copy editing this week by Melissa No and Francis Moody. Mixing and sound design is by Jim Briggs and Justin Garish. Our theme music is by Edith Mudge. Our director of audio is Renita Jablonski. I'm Jeff Pierre. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and I will meet you back here on Monday.
You know, business today runs on many clouds, but managing all those clouds can be chaotic. VMware helps you move from cloud chaos to cloud smart. Purpose-built for multi-cloud. VMware cross-cloud services simplify management, empower developers, enable great customer experiences, and improve employee productivity. With VMware, you gain the choice, security, and control you need to drive business forward in a world of many clouds. VMware, the smarter way to cloud. Learn more at vmware.com.
Whatever it is. And if we had just done what we said and built a single payer healthcare system, we would never have to revisit the healthcare financing question again. It'd be done. And like, I'm very sympathetic to that, but it runs at cross purposes to this idea that we should mire everything in rulemaking and like never just trust the state to do the right thing. In fact, like if anything, you would think that the state capacity liberals and the single payer progressives would be on the same page about this stuff, but it seems to me like they tend not to be.
That's interesting.
But maybe you could maybe persuade them of the value proposition you bring in. Is like it applies to healthcare as much as it applies to
measure. Sure.
Pipelines and
I buy that. I'm not sure that speaks to people with the level of like the level of emotion that you want to grab members of, like people care about these issues because it moves them deeply. And I'm not sure that kind of I'm for simplicity kind of argument is what's going to do it. The one that I wonder about is really going to move the left. I view the issues that I write about as social justice issues and questions of equity in the broad sense that if you make housing too expensive for people, it's going to hurt the poor and the disadvantaged. If you don't transition to clean energy, the folk who are going to suffer the brunt of climate adaptation are the poor and disadvantaged. If you do not actually shut down coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants, the folk who are going to get harmed by the smoke and fumes that are coming out of those facilities are the poor and disadvantaged. If you can't build reliable public infrastructure, the folk who are going to be harmed most are those who depend most on it. So I think of this as a way of helping the most disadvantaged among us, including racial minorities, but also including future generations, our kids' kids. And I think that's a message that the Democratic coalition can hear. I don't think that the folk who care about those issues the most, who are centered around those issues, share my attitude about what's holding us back. My concern, like I think many of them are doubling down on some of these procedures in an effort to protect what they care about most. But that's how I think about the project.
Well, I guess in my experience with progressives and people on the left generally is that like the emotional resonance of the simplicity thing isn't the simplicity, it's the panacea. Like there's a major injustice and we are going to bring one hammer down and it's going to be fixed, right? Yeah. And that's the appeal of single payer. I think that people also want a big panacea for climate change, right? They want the Green New Deal, right? They want one bill and we've done everything we possibly can to do this. And there's like a hopeful future. And I think similarly in the housing realm and other things, there's so many obvious, visible, tragic problems that like, if you can approach them with this, like, look, if we just make some changes to how we allow government to operate, we can solve this problem much, 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 much faster than if we don't. And that there's a coherence there.
I am sympathetic.
They see it in breaking up the big banks and in single payer healthcare, but it's a very similar concept.
I mean, I think there's something to be said for valuing simplicity because complexity has costs that are hard for you to always see or acknowledge, and that you may otherwise paper over. And so, part of my concern here is that people think, adopt NEPA and people just think about the environmental consequences. It's no big thing. But it turns out in practice, when it's institutionalized at an agency, it becomes paralytic, right? It actually makes it much harder than you would expect on the outside. By the same token, the complexity of our healthcare system creates unbelievable problems that we would love to be able to wave a magic wand and get away from. So I'm sympathetic. I will say, I think in all of these contexts, progressives might just want a big hammer. That wasn't on the table in 2010, as much as I wish it were. And there's not going to be a big hammer for the green energy revolution. There's not going to be a big hammer for housing. There's not going to be a big hammer for infrastructure. These are all individual fights that we're going to have to fight relentlessly, doggedly, day after day, day after day, day after day. And it's tiring. It's exhausting. It's hard. But that's politics.
Okay, last question then. Do you think that by, say, like September of next year, there will be enough big developments, big projects, either underway or completed from Biden's first 2 years for him to be able to go campaign, not just on like the normal stuff, but to be able to point to big, cool things and say, you want more of that, or you want to go back to the wall on the border that never got built? Is that is that possible, or are things like NEPA, judicial review, whatever else, going to leave Biden in September 2024 saying, trust me, these things are coming unless you vote me out?
A little bit of both. There have been extraordinary investments in bringing industrial plants to mainly red states, but here in Michigan as well. We've got new EV plants, we've got new chip plants coming online. There are going to be sites where they've broken ground at least, and sites where they've even made more progress, no question about it. Will there be all of the jobs that are promised? Will they have materialized by next year? No. Will there be, new bridges that are coming out of the ground that weren't there at all 2 years before? No. Will there be massive new renewable facilities and sites that were not even under contemplation before the Inflation Reduction Act? No. But we're making progress on all these fronts. He'll have something to point to. The question is whether that'll resonate with people or whether they've just written off, politicians who make these promises as if they're empty. I think one tragedy, if that were to be the case, is that, like you said at the beginning, Joe Biden's promises here have not been empty. I mean, the amount of money that he put behind some of these initiatives is extraordinary. There hasn't been commensurate thought given yet to getting rid of some of these procedural roadblocks, but there is thought and effort being put into that. And I am optimistic that the trajectory is the right direction. Whether he'll get credit for that is another question altogether.
We shall see. Nicholas Bagley, thank you for spending so much of your time with us this week. This was a really edifying conversation.
Oh, I mean, it was an honor. Thanks for having me on.
Positively Dreadful is a Crooked Media production. Our executive producer is Michael Martinez. Our associate producer is Emma Illick-Frank. And a hearty send-off to our intern, Naomi Birnbaum. Evan Sutton mixes and edits the show each week. Our theme music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos. Person of the Week, a brand new podcast from Time, is a weekly, not-to-be-missed conversation with the people who are shaping our era. For 100 years, people have turned to Time to understand the world around them. And now, senior correspondent Charlotte Alter hosts weekly candid conversations with politicians and celebrities like Ethan Hawke, Elliot Page, and Maxwell Frost. Get to know household names and emerging leaders in a way you never have, and listen to Time's Person of the Week wherever you get your podcasts.
Pronoun and tell your friends to listen.
And if you're into reading and not just fights between New York governors and New York City mayors like me, What a Day is also a nightly newsletter. Check it out and subscribe at crooked.com/subscribe. I'm Juanita Tolliver.
I'm Priyanka Arabindi. And you go, AP Schreff.
I bet AP Schreff is that cool teacher, cool administrator who literally kids lean on to survive high school.
1,000%. You're cool, and we feel special to have you. So thank you so much for listening to the show.
Yes.
And doing what you do. You're amazing.
Yes. Keep being amazing. Keep commenting on our Discord.
Individual shout outs to everybody who gives Wad some love on the Discord.
What a Day is a production of Crooked Media. It's recorded and mixed by Bill Lance. Our show's producer is Itzy Quintanilla. Raven Yamamoto and Natalie Bettendorf are our associate producers. Our intern is Ryan Cochran, and our senior producer is Lita Martinez. Our theme music is by Colin Gilliard and Kashaka. It's Friday, August 18th. I'm Juanita Tolliver.
And I'm Josie Duffy Rice. And this is What a Day, where we just want people to leave Britney Spears the hell alone.
Like that early 2000s video. And we're sending her so much love and healing as she goes through a messy divorce.
Yeah. Also, if you don't get the Leave Britney Spears the hell alone meme, you gotta look it up.
Get to the Googles.
Very important part of early 2000s culture, okay? Crucial.
On today's show, Maui authorities released the identities of 3 more wildfire victims. Plus, we've got an out-of-this-world installment of Josie vs. Science in store for you also. Prepare yourselves.
Oh no, I'm preparing myself. But first, yesterday, the New York Times published a report about documents that contain private, detailed debate advice seemingly intended for Governor Ron DeSantis ahead of next week's first Republican primary debate. It is yet another embarrassing moment in a campaign packed full of embarrassing moments, in fact.
Yeah, I feel like this is what you get when you fire 40% of your staff. But here we are. First things first. How exactly did the New York Times get their hands on these documents?
Yeah, this is actually a pretty interesting part of the story because the documents weren't leaked or anything. They were available publicly after a company called Axiom Strategies posted these documents on their website earlier this week. So Axiom Strategies is owned by Jeff Rowe. Jeff Rowe runs DeSantis' super PAC, which is hilariously called Never Back Down.
Honestly, this is the time to pack it up and go home. But I'm not naming any names. Like, let's be real. This is a common practice in politics.
Yeah.
I just have never seen it go so poorly. Like, was there any thought put into this?
Yeah, like you just said, this is actually like a fairly common practice because these documents were posted online, but they weren't intended to be seen by anyone other than the people who knew where to look. And the reason for that is, as you mentioned, it's illegal for super PACs to strategize privately with campaigns and candidates. They can't have these private interactions, so they have to like post their private strategy ideas, quote, publicly, meaning that they buy a domain, they put the documents on there, they give someone the address, they can be downloaded, but nobody really knows that they exist, right? And that's sort of what happened here. Like the super PAC thought they'd get away with posting the documents on their site without it being noticed, but then someone noticed them and told the New York Times, and that person was not on DeSantis' campaign or the super PAC, so not the brightest.
Not the brightest, and if my imagination is correct, I bet the URL was something like homewebsite.com/super secret DeSantis documents. You know, like that's what it's giving.
Yeah, 100%.
Why would they do that though? Why would they post these documents on their own website or a
that
website
was a
closely
fast
related to
kill.
them?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. Like most people would buy a different domain name and put them on there so that they couldn't be found. It's very unusual and frankly stupid that Axiom Strategies posted these documents directly on their own website.
Yeah, I don't know what their hourly rate is that they're charging this campaign, but it's clearly not worth it. So break it down for us. What exactly is in these documents?
It's like hundreds and hundreds of pages of what the New York Times calls, quote, blunt advice, research memos, and internal polling. And included in these documents, most notably, were these exceedingly detailed suggestions about what DeSantis needs to do in the debate to help his really flailing campaign. So are you ready?
All right, let's do this rapid fire. I'm just going to give a quick reaction with every point you make. Let's go.
Perfect. Okay, so this is a direct quote. Number 1, attack Joe Biden and the media 3 to 5 times.
Only 3 to 5 times? I feel like that would be the strategy in play every time he opens his mouth, but 3 to 5 times. Okay, sure.
Yeah, that was my thought too. Like 3 to 5 times is not that many times, right? Okay, number 2, state GRD. That's what they call DeSantis in the documents. It stands for Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis, state GRD's positive vision 2 to 3 times.
Okay, if you have to tell him to state his vision, it's giving programming chatbot. Like, that's what this is. Like, he is clearly a robot that they have to tell this to, and that's a pretty low bar.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a reasonable suggestion, but it doesn't feel like it would need to be even said. Number 3, hammer Vivek Ramaswamy in a response.
Oh no, that's giving punch down. Like, yikes, because it also tells people how far he's fallen. Like, if my name is mentioned with Vivek's, then I'm not up top.
Yeah, the truth is that it might be punching up, because in some places Ramaswamy is polling pretty neck and neck with him, which is really truly a side sign. Okay, number 4, and this is the best one. Defend Donald Trump in absentia in response to a Chris Christie attack. It's dark.
Defend the man with 91 criminal counts? Like, what? I'm so confused.
Defend the man who's trashing you nonstop, your main competitor.
Day in and day out.
That's just incredible advice from a Republican strategist. And it's probably not even bad advice, because the Republican Party is so full of sycophants who love Trump so much, that DeSantis has to actually defend the guy.
It's sickening, but also hearing this strategy and the points you just mentioned, I'm just like, it's not going to help DeSantis. He literally needs to just pack it up right now, because there's no clearer sign that DeSantis is in trouble than his biggest supporters, his campaign strategists telling him he has to defend Trump. Like, what?
Right. It's worth noting that the documents try to spin defending Trump in a way that would theoretically make Trump look weak. They suggest that if Chris Christie attacks Trump, DeSantis should say something like, quote, Trump isn't here, so let's just leave him alone. He's too weak to defend himself here.
It's giving leave Britney alone.
It's giving leave Britney alone. And it is so funny to tell this man to call Donald Trump weak when Donald Trump is polling 40 points ahead.
Across the board.
Donald Trump is beating you, boo. He's not
It's almost like his campaign advisors are telling him, hey, just clear the path for Trump. That's all you got to do. He is the pick in the pick and roll. That's all I know about basketball. Don't ask me anything else.
I don't even know what that part means, but it sounded really good. The other things worth noting are that these documents basically suggest that DeSantis don't talk about policy at all during the debate, because it's not going to get media attention. So they don't even mention policy in this many pages long document about the debate. And they also mentioned something called the Roger Ailes orchestra pit theory.
Yikes.
For those who don't know, Roger Ailes, now deceased, former head of Fox News, pretty horrid human being all around, had a orchestra pit theory that basically said, quote, a candidate who lays out a comprehensive plan on foreign policy will draw less coverage than the one who accidentally falls off the debate stage.
I guess.
Which, I mean, if you fall off the stage, I'm going to watch that. That's about I don't know if that's exactly how you want to frame your campaign strategy.
Especially a presidential campaign, because yikes.
It's really bananas. So basically, this document lists potential, quote, orchestra pit moments for DeSantis, including that they suggest that DeSantis should make up a Trump-style nickname for Ramaswamy. And what they suggest is fake Vivek or Vivek the fake.
Okay.
These people are paid lots of money to do campaign strategy.
Thrown in the garbage, because one, all they're saying is try to be like Trump as you promote Trump and then defend Trump, which is ridiculous strategy. And two, fake Vivek, like, it's a weak response. It's ridiculous.
It's also such a stupid nickname. It's so clearly trying to imitate Trump. It's just crazy. Anyway, these documents included a lot of other stuff too. Turnout estimates, 17 pages of attack strategy, apparently including about attacking Ramaswamy, 400 pages of detailed polling about New Hampshire, a dossier about Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, who truly nobody even knows is running for president. At all. Like, that's the kind of state that DeSantis is in, right? Like, he's trying to ward off candidates who I've basically never even heard of. And here's the funniest / saddest part of these documents. They at some point kind of just remind him to try to act kind of human. They, quote, invoke a personal anecdote story about family, kids, Casey showing emotion. Casey's his wife.
I told you, they're programming a chatbot. That's literally what this is. Hey, be human, robot.
It's so bizarre.
Also, our bingo cards are set for the debate night drinking game. Every time DeSantis does one of these things included in this document, then you got to take a shot. I don't make the rules. We're just here.
You're going to be very drunk, so just drink some water in between.
All right, y'all, we're going to pivot from a ridiculous story to a very demented story. So earlier this month, a Texas woman was arrested and charged with threatening to kill U.S. District Court Judge Tanya Chutkan, the judge who is currently overseeing Trump's criminal case stemming from his federal indictment regarding January 6th and efforts to overturn the 2020 election. According to court documents, Abigail Jo Schrei left a threatening message on Judge Chutkan's office phone number on August 5th. Now, I'm not going to repeat the violent and racist statements that Schrei made, but in addition to threatening the life of Judge Chutkan, she also threatened the life of Democratic Congresswoman and candidate for mayor of Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee.
Yeah, this story is obviously scary, disturbing, and also very dumb. I have to,
come on,
once again, as nobody's lawyer, I just want to underscore that you should not call judges and threaten them on their phone.
Step one, don't call a judge.
Don't call a judge. Don't
leave a message.
Don't leave a message and don't threaten them. So, where is this woman now? The message leaver.
Schrei is still in custody after a judge denied her bail and ordered her to be jailed for 30 days after a detention hearing. Also, this isn't the first time that she has faced charges related to making threats, as she's been charged with similar crimes 4 times in the last year. So it's like once a quarter, she does something like this. Sadly, Schrei's decision to target and threaten Judge Chutkan is not far off from the threats Trump has posted online, which has included statements like, quote, if you go after me, I'm coming after you, in all caps, no less. It's dangerous, it's unhinged, and we can only expect the rage to increase as Judge Chutkan is scheduled to announce a trial start date on Monday, August 28th. Considering that Trump is requesting an April 2026 trial date, he's definitely about to be disappointed again.
I almost admire asking a judge to put a trial off for 3 years.
Ooh, child.
That is really next level. And it also seems like related to this, that Trump supporters are engaging in some targeted harassment down here in Georgia too, right?
100%. The latest reports out of Georgia are that the Fulton County Sheriff's Office is investigating targeted threats against members of the grand jury that indicted Trump and 18 others earlier this week. I can't get over the fact that that was this week, including circulating their home addresses, social media profiles, and photographs in right-wing groups, though the media has yet to confirm that all of the information is correct. Now, the jurors' names were already public and unredacted in the indictment itself, but as this information is making the rounds online, there are huge concerns for the safety of these individuals and their families. And honestly, I can't help but think about the fear and the harassment that Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss described to the January 6th Select Committee about how Trump and his supporters lashed out at them. It's a sickening reality that this threat is very real.
Yeah, it really is. And it makes it very difficult to find people who can serve in this capacity, right? Because we want people to do jury duty, but
right, all they did was a public service and now they're being tracked.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, hopefully these jurors are able to maintain their safety and their privacy, because there's nothing like having a former president coming after you. We'll continue to bring you updates on these stories, but that's the latest for now. Let's get to some headlines.
Headlines.
Maui authorities released the identities of 3 more wildfire victims on Thursday as the death toll from the disaster rose to 111. All 5 who have been identified so far are elderly, and thousands still remain unaccounted for. And as of our recording time at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, rescue workers have searched about 40% of Lahaina for missing persons. Meanwhile, President Biden confirmed that he and First Lady Joe Biden will travel to Maui on Monday to speak with survivors and survey the damage. But the visit could prove contentious. White House officials announced earlier this week that FEMA would give each displaced family a one-time payment of up to $700 in aid to cover essentials. I'm screaming because these are individuals who just lost family members and loved ones. They just lost all their possessions in their homes. And you think $700 a household is going to cut it?
Are we seeing the same pictures of what these people are facing? This is the most deadly wildfire in American history. It is just destroyed people's entire life. $700 is a joke.
And let's just say that this announcement didn't go over very well with local residents, given how high the cost of living is in the islands. According to the World Population Review, Hawaii is the most expensive state to live in. A living wage for a family there is over $107,000 per year, and a single home costs an average of $730,000. That's not even accounting for how groceries cost 50% more than the national average because of import taxes. And if Biden's going to be on the ground on Monday, I really hope the White House is rolling out some additional funding announcements before he touches down, because otherwise I have no idea how this is going to go.
Now for an update on the latest developments in Niger, where the country's democratically elected president remains under house arrest after military officers ousted him from office last month. Defense chiefs from ECOWAS, the West African Regional Bloc, met yesterday in Ghana to discuss efforts to reinstate President Mohamed Bazoum, and a senior official there told army chiefs that ECOWAS is ready to intervene in Niger if the coup is not reversed. Yesterday's meeting comes after ECOWAS ordered the deployment of a, quote, standby force last week, a move that was prompted after coup leaders defied an August 6th deadline to restore the ousted president or face possible military intervention. It still remains unclear if and when an intervention could happen. Meanwhile, France and the United States have suspended military operations in the country, a move which the Associated Press reports has led to an increase in attacks. Earlier this week, at least 17 soldiers in the country were killed and nearly 24 wounded in the first major jihadi attack in 6 months.
California and the southwest region of the U.S. could be in for some heavy rains and flash floods tonight as Hurricane Hillary heads north. The storm, which formed off the southern Pacific coast of Mexico earlier this week, was upgraded to a Category 2 hurricane on Thursday, and forecasters say it could escalate to a Category 4 by the end of the week. While the storm isn't expected to make landfall in the United States, forecasters say that California could see several months' worth of rainfall in just 1 or 2 days, triggering potential floods. And neighboring Nevada could also see some severe weather. If Hillary does make landfall in California, it will be the first time the Golden State has seen a tropical storm in 84 years. Forecasters say that the storm will reach its peak on Sunday and Monday before moving even further north.
And finally, the Little Rock School District in Arkansas announced that schools will offer advanced placement African American studies despite guidelines from the state. Earlier this week, Arkansas's education department said that the content in the course could possibly violate a new law banning indoctrination in schools. Indoctrination to learn African American studies.
Yeah, I feel like we need to pause here because it's learning about the truth of the history of this country, learning about the truth that Black people have experienced, and we can't do that.
Indoctrination. I have to remember
signed
that.
an executive order back in January banning, quote, indoctrination and critical race theory in schools. In further efforts to discourage schools from offering the class, state officials said that the course might not provide credit towards graduation and that the state would not help students pay the nearly $100 AP test fee. Arkansas is not the only state to restrict access to the class, and Florida issued a ban on the course earlier this year. In response to these decisions, the NAACP president Derek Johnson said, quote, let's be clear, the continued state-level attacks on Black history are undemocratic and regressive.
100%. You want to punish the students who want to learn about African American history and studies. It's a shame that Ruby Bridges is alive to witness this ridiculousness. It's a shame that Little Rock School District has to make this decision against the state to act out on its own. And if y'all are hosting any fundraisers to support students with these test fees, please sign me up immediately.
There are members of the Little Rock Nine alive right now.
Right.
They are alive today.
Right.
They had to integrate that school while being yelled at, screamed at, things thrown at them, had to have protection from the National Guard. I mean, like, this is like current history, and we're being called indoctrination. It's just insane.
If you needed your weekly reminder about how racist Republicans and the Republican Party is with these policies, here you go.
Yeah, these are the people who keep telling us we're crazy for calling them racist. And then they're like, hey, we actually think our kids don't get to learn about Black people.
Well, those are the headlines, y'all. We'll be back after some ads.
This show is sponsored.
I think I'll end it there. Yeah, I'm going to have to get something to eat now. But thank you for staying tuned to my live stream as I relax by killing aliens, virtual aliens. I leveled up my auto rifle in this little bit of time. Let me see. It's not a great auto, but I added another perk there. But yeah, this is okay. It's got range. The Psycho Hack is pretty good. And for arc, I like the lower damage that you can take and still is this, I forget how the works, but that's pretty cool. You can, so yeah, pretty good day. I am still trying to sync up these videos, and I have no idea how that's going to work, but after I eat, I'm going to make the links for Greg's live stream, and maybe this video will have synced up so I can make a video to promote his live stream. But if you're watching me and you haven't subscribed to us on YouTube, go to Mail Media Mind on YouTube. That's youtube.com/mailmediamind. And if you hit the bell, you'll be notified when we go live. Tomorrow at noon, Greg will be hosting a live stream. And if you'd like to support Mail Media Mind on a more permanent basis, like a monthly basis, we have a Patreon, just one tier. And that tier, you get a early video version of the M3 Bearcast and a after show on each of our live streams. We have one Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday. All right. On that note, I gotta get to the rest of my day, and I will catch you on the next one. Thank you for watching.